The Ramchal yesterday, Rabbi Luzzatto, had said that the objective of perfection, what is perfection, is to be able to be in a state that you could cleave to God on the ultimate level. That's what it's all about. If you achieve that level of perfection, you're able to cleave, you've accomplished this concept of perfection. And he said this is based on verses, and it's based on passages in the Gemara, Talmud, and it's logical. And he cited a number of verses, number of psukim. One pasuk he cited was a verse in Yeshaya, Isaiah. Then you will oneg, you'll have the ultimate joy with God, together with God. You will sit in the presence of his countenance. You will be sated to the maximum with joy due to being in his presence. Those are the verses. And he said there are many others. Then he cites the passage in the Gemara. What is the world to come? It's not feasting, it's not drinking, there's no sitting, there's no standing, but every person, based on his level of accomplishment, he sits with a crown on his head and he basks in the radiance of God. That's what the world to come is. Basking in God's radiance. That's the ultimate. The soul in its essence. What is a human being? A human being is a composite of physical and spiritual. And we discussed this in the past. If you ask anyone, do you have a soul? Are you an intellectual animal? Or are you a composite of the spiritual and the physical? Now, how do we know? Does anybody sense a soul? Nobody senses a soul. You have to be maybe somebody who's a prophet, who God communicates with him, because the communication of a prophet with God is not through the human faculty, but directly to the soul. Or a person who's spiritually advanced at a level which doesn't exist, hasn't existed since going back 1,000 years. A person's divinely inspired, but otherwise, how do we know we have a soul? It's a very basic, fundamental question. The answer is that every aspect relating to spirituality, relating even to God, what's the basis for our understanding and knowledge and our potential and our value? This took place at Sinai. When we stood at the mountain and God openly communicated to every Jew who stood in the proximity of that mountain. Every Jew prophesied, every Jew was in touch directly with God's presence in a wake state, similar to the context of Moshe's prophesying. At that moment, besides hearing the 10 commandments, what was communicated to us was that our essence, the core of our being, is our soul. The soul is totally a spiritual entity, which its value and its innate is eternal. The body only presents the challenges, which gives value to the initiatives which are taken due to the soul. So that I and you know we have a soul, it's all based on tradition from Sinai. This is something God revealed to us that's part of our, what we call our Masorah. The same way we know that every aspect of the Torah is the word of God, because that's called Masorah, that's passed down from generation to generation. Because what was at Sinai was our souls. We have no recollection of that because we exist as physical beings, but we know what our core is and what our value is and what our purpose is and what our objective is. That's due to the tradition that was passed down generation after generation from Sinai. where every Jew understood and believed to internalize to his being the reality of his value. Well, we became the chosen people. So the essence of the soul is totally spiritual. Being totally spiritual, it has no relevance to the physical whatsoever. The physical value is only to facilitate the spiritual. So what's the innate desire of the soul? To amass material, which has no relevance to its essence, or is to perfect itself, to be able to cleave to its source, which is God himself. Now, when we do a mitzvah, we have 248 positive commandments. When you put on your talus, the text of the blessing is Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav. This text was authored by the men of the High Assembly. You've sanctified us through your mitzvos. And this, Rabbi Luzzatto discusses in Path of the Just. A human being is a physical being. Physical, earthy. We're able to spiritualize and sanctify and elevate the earthiness of the physicality through sanctification. And the Chafetz Chaim writes, if you take a sheep, a goat, a bull, and you consecrate it as a sacrifice, what are we dealing with? It's an entity, unintelligible, no soul, just a life source, and it's unblemished. You consecrate it, it becomes an entity of holiness. Because it was designated for the sacrifice. And that brings it, elevates it, that has a consecrated status. It's holy. It can only be used for that particular purpose, for sacrifice, for atonement. So the Chafetz Chaim writes, if an unintelligible creature, if it's designated for God's value, it assumes a consecrated, a holy status. So a Jew who, his essence is his soul, which innately, there's nothing comparable in existence to that. And the Jew goes and takes initiatives and sanctifies his life through investing it in commandments. So when we do the mitzvah, whether it's the tzitzis, whether it's the tefillin, whether it's the sukkah, or it's listening to the shofar, what's happening to our physicality? We're consecrating, we're sanctifying our physicality. When we sanctify our physicality, we create a relevance that we have a relation with God. You know, in the third blessing of the Amidah, what's the third blessing of the Amidah? Ata Kadosh, you are holy. The Shimcha Kadosh, your name is holy. Ukedoshim Chol Yomi Ad L'Selo. And every day, those who praise you are holy. Now, who praises God every day? The angels and the Jewish people. Now, what makes us holy? We're holy because of the way we live our lives. You do the mitzvos. Who praises God? Those who do mitzvos, those who follow his commandments and are sanctified. Even when you do the Amidah, according to Maimonides, Rambam, praying, entering into audience with God once a day is a Torah obligation. So when you take 3 steps forward and you begin that conversation, you're entering into a state of sanctification. You're sanctifying yourself. When you sanctify, you have relevance to what God is. You're holy, your name's holy. And those who praise you are holy. But every time we do a mitzvah, we keep advancing and intensifying the degree of that holiness. That's what we're doing. And that's exactly, and the physicality of the Jew becomes consecrated as a result that what is the overt influence in the physical being's life? The soul. The soul represents everything which has relevance to spirituality. So when one makes a choice to take the initiative, to use the physical, the earthy, to facilitate the advancement of the soul, it takes on that value. Therefore, the text of the blessing, when we say, do we do a mitzvah, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav. You've sanctified us through your mitzvos. And that sanctification is an ongoing process of advancement, elevation, getting us close enough to achieve perfection. Because what's perfection? As he said, it's rooted in text, in verse and text. It's to be able to cleave to the Holy One, to cleave to God. As God is perfect, the more we advance our leveling closer to perfection, and we're more qualified, then we've achieved the objective. It's interesting. A parent has a child. The DNA of the child is the same DNA of the parent. But let's say the child is estranged to the parent and there's no relevance to the parent. You may have the same DNA, but there's no connection between the two, the parent and the child. But what about the child appreciates and values the values of the parents, and it creates a commonality? So, and that behavior is rooted in the innate characteristics of the DNA. Each one reflects the other one. The child reflects the behavior of the parent, but that behavior, the reason why that person has the capacity and the capability to do that is because it's within his DNA. But we know we could express that DNA because a person has choice, go in the opposite direction. The Torah tells us that a person, God forbid, is put to death through stoning because he violated certain negative commandments. So after he's stoned, stoning doesn't mean, as we say, like the Taliban, they stone someone. It doesn't mean that the body is pummeled with stones, but rather a person is put on an elevated platform, the equivalent of his own height. His feet are tied together and his hands are tied behind his back, and he's pushed off backwards. He breaks his neck. And after he breaks his neck, they take a stone and put it on his chest. That's called stoning. So the Torah says after the person's stoned, his remains should be displayed, and then he has to be interred. He has to be buried. Why? Because leaving his remains displayed is disgracing God. That's called disgracing God. So Rashi cites the Midrash. What is it analogous to? The two brothers, identical twins. One is the king, and one is a highwayman, a bandit. And there's a bounty on the bandit's head. Then when he's caught, he'll be hanged. And they hang the bandit, the highwayman. When he's hanging there, what do people say? The king is hanging. It's a disgrace to the king. Man was created in the image of God. So if man was created in the image of God and you disgrace that image, what are you doing? You're disgracing God. It's like the king's son is hanging, God forbid. You're disgracing the king. So how do we go and create that commonality to be able to cleave to God? It's by achieving perfection, creating the holiness. You're estranged, you're alienated, and you do everything contrary to that. Then you have no relevance to God. You may reflect an image, but it's something that you have no relevance. There's no commonality. So what is perfection? Keep advancing yourself, climbing that ladder of spirituality. Each mitzvah you do, it's another level of advancement, another level of intensity, increasing intensity of that holiness. And the more you increase it, the greater you're able to cleave for that reason. This is the concept. He says, naturally, we know what is the ultimate mitzvah which impacts on which creates the ultimate level of holiness for a Jew, the study of Torah. You study Torah, that's Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. That is the greatest impact and effect on our status. Every mitzvah, as I mentioned, we mentioned the name of the Rav Chaim Vital, who's the student of the Arizal, who recorded all his Kabbalistic writings. Every positive commandment corresponds to a component of the soul. There's a correlating factor. The Torah, the study of Torah is the totality of the soul. So when you go and you do tzitzis, there is a certain component of the neshama, of the soul, which corresponds to that. It's infusion in that component. You put on tefillin, it's an infusion, another one. Eat kosher, another one. Whatever we do, when you study Torah, it's the totality. It touches every aspect of your soul. So the soul is elevated in its totality when you study Torah. And if you study Torah qualitatively, without an ulterior motive, purely for the sake of God, the intensity of that value of that mitzvah, it's what we call mega. It's a mega holiness. It's a mega infusion of holiness. It advances you even higher. You know, a person who lives a life of Judaism in a proper context, and every aspect of our minds, our actions, and our speech are invested in Judaism, that person ultimately will achieve a level of sanctification within himself that he will feel, and he will have a sense of things which the average person doesn't have a sense of. He'll create certain sensitivities. Lahavdil, person is a well-weathered businessman. He's been through the thick and thin of business, and he succeeded, which only proves that he has certain senses of what is a profitable deal and what shouldn't even be considered. He has like a sixth sense due to his experience within the financial field. He's developed a sense. Lahavdil, a person who's been spiritualized and immersed in Torah study and is knowledgeable, and he's invested his physicality in the spiritual realm, and he sanctified it. Due to that sanctification, he has certain senses, because now the soul has been advanced within the physical context. Therefore, you have senses. The soul has senses. Those senses are dormant. But if you consecrate the physicality, that blockage is not as much. You're always entombed until we die, till the soul departs. But it's only entombed to a greater degree because the physicality of the body is totally physical. But if you should spiritualize the physicality of the body, we find Moshe Rabbeinu, he radiated. There's a radiance. What happened? Because his body was so spiritualized, the physicality of the body didn't prevent the radiance of the soul from shining forth. Even every one of us, there's not going to be that radiance, but there will be a spiritualization. And because of that spiritualization, you have senses and you have an understanding of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I once told over a story, Chazon Ish, his name was Rabbi Karelitz, or Avram Yishai Karelitz. He invested every fiber of his being in serving God and Torah, and passed away in the early 50s. And he once had a long conversation with Ben Gurion, when the state of Israel was founded. And Ben Gurion knew Tanakh. Ben Gurion did not believe in God. Ben Gurion did not believe in God. And he knew more than the greatest rabbis. Why? Because he was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, just in the text, in the verses. but he never met a person like the Chazon Ish. It's like a person is a featherweight and he meets a heavyweight. Instead, it doesn't take long before the feather, you just see a bunch of strands of hairs. They're already detached from the center, from the core. So finally, when he saw that Chazon Ish outwitted him, was endlessly beyond him, he says, could you cite a source for your position? How are you so confident that your position is correct? So you know what he did? He opened the shirt and he pointed to his heart. My heart tells me this is the truth. I don't need any proofs. It's my heart that tells me that this is truth. You understand? His heart was a different heart. The Chazon Ish, that every fiber of his being was fully invested in doing the will of God, Torah-wise, mitzvah-wise, purely for the sake. His heartbeat, the sensitivity of his heart was different than the average person's heart. My heart tells me this is the truth. Libi Omer, my heart tells me. There's something which is called sage advice, sage wisdom. What's sage wisdom? It's like an endowment. But very often, sage wisdom doesn't develop in a vacuum. It comes about somehow. I'm not saying sage wisdom doesn't exist in other areas in life. Advising people how to live their lives in an appropriate way, sage wisdom, or how to invest, sage wisdom. But when we speak about sage wisdom, what a sage is, that equates with godliness to a degree, or to a great degree. It's a whole other thing, but that's due to what? The sanctification of the person. Therefore, the text of every bracha, blessing which has runs to a mitzvah, the text is Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvah. You've given us the mitzvahs to sanctify us. That is the catalyst that creates the attachment between us and God. That's how we achieve perfection, by always advancing ourselves through that mechanism called mitzvah.